So, scrutiny of EU legislative proposal COM 2019-103. Is it agreed that COM 2019-103 does not require further scrutiny? Is that agreed? Agreed. So, detailed scrutiny of the Microgeneration Supports Scheme Bill 2017. We're now going to resume our detailed scrutiny of the Microgeneration Support Scheme Bill 2017. And I would like to welcome our witnesses here this afternoon. From Grid, we have Dr. Eamon Ryan, Executive Director, Grid Development. We also have Mr. Arthur Moynihan, Operations, Planning and Innovation. From the ESB, we have Mr. Peter O'Shea, Head of Corporate and Regulatory Affairs, and Dr. Fergal McNamara, Manager of Regulation and Policy. From the Microelectricity Generation Association, we have Mr. Dudley Stewart, Director, Mr. Jean Hourahan, Managing Director, Sunstream Energy Solutions, and from the Dublin Technological University, we have Dr. Keith Sutherland, Head of Electrical Services, Engineering and Energy Management. So before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'll just remind members and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones or to put them onto flight mode as they affect our sound system. The format of the meeting will be that you're invited to make an opening statement of no longer than 5 minutes, and I'll indicate after 4, so you know you've 1 minute remaining, and the opening statements then will be followed by our members who will put questions to the witnesses. So I now invite Dr. Ryan from Grid to make your opening statement.
Thank you. Chair and members of the committee, thank you very much, committee, for inviting us here today. I'd like to take this opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss the key area of how we can better integrate increased levels of renewables into the electricity system. I would also like to thank Deputy Stanley and other committee members for focusing on this key area in the move to decarbonise. I'm joined today by my colleague Arthur Moynihan, who leads our work on developing energy scenarios out to 2040. These scenarios include those that envisage a significant increase in microgeneration over the coming years. This will be along with the existing conventional and offshore renewable generation, as well as expected significant growth on areas such as offshore generation in the coming decade. As a background for those who are less familiar with our work, since 2006, Grid has operated and developed the national high voltage electricity system in Ireland. We develop and manage and operate the electricity transmission system through Grid in Ireland and Sony in Northern Ireland. Our transmission grid brings power from where it is generated to where it is needed through Ireland and Northern Ireland. We use the grid to supply power to industries and business, and use large amounts of electricity. Here in the Republic, our grid also powers the ESB's distribution system. This supplies electricities you use every day in your homes, business, schools, hospitals and farms. In more recent years, our grid has formed a pathway to harness the significant growth in renewable energy projects which are required to bring about the energy transition. These projects that connect into our transmission system are usually approximately 40 megawatts and above. A significant development over the last decade has been Ireland's ability to deliver renewables onto our system. Today, we are now capable of accommodating a record level of 60% variable renewables on the electricity generated at any one point in time. This achievement was recognised in the recent Oireachtas Committee Climate Action Report, and we thank the members present here today for that recognition. However, however, we all know that we need to do more, and additional renewables. We need to make sure that additional renewables are brought onto the system. EirGrid, as transmission system operator, agrees that microgeneration can and will be a central component to the next phase of renewables. Moreover, we believe that the current piece of legislation being considered by the committee has significant merits in making microgeneration a reality in communities across rural and urban Ireland. As part of our role, we identified those growing Irish energy trends. EirGrid has placed a huge emphasis on developing scenario planning to help us consider the range of possible ways the energy usage may change in the future. Speaking to a wide range of stakeholders and industry bodies, we gather and use this information to ensure we plan and develop the electricity transmission grid to meet the future needs of our society and economy. We published our first iteration of tomorrow's energy scenarios in 2017. This entailed developing a set of scenarios outlining 4 possible futures for the supply and consumption of electricity out to 2040. The EirGrid scenarios were each based on different storylines. Our scenarios assume different levels of microgeneration capacity depending on the scenario and its associated storyline. An example is our customer action scenario, which assumed the highest level of microgeneration connected to the distribution grid. It is fair to say that rooftop solar PV is assumed to be the primary microgeneration technology in the future as a result of falling manufacturing and installation costs, financial incentives and ongoing changes to the building regulation. The EirGrid consumer action scenario assumed that 30% of the overall solar generation fleet will be rooftop solar PV. This would equate to 450 megawatts of rooftop solar PV and presents a significant and positive step change from where we are today. Taking the capacity factors into account and the stated requirement in the bill of electricity suppliers to supply 5% of the electricity from microgeneration, this would translate into a need to install approximately 2 gigawatts of solar PV at microgeneration level. If we consider this against the peak electricity demand of approximately 3.5 gigawatts on a summer day, it is clear that microgeneration will make up a significant portion of the overall electricity generation on a sunny day. If this ambition is realised, this would bring a challenge in terms of balancing electricity supply and demand on a minute-by-minute basis, and that we would need to find innovative solutions to address it. However, we are actively considering these challenges in recognition that renewable level will only increase, and also recognising that at a consumer level we expect considerable shift in consumer patterns in terms of demand response and increase in electricity vehicles and heat pumps. Our scenario also suggests that battery energy storage technologies will play a significant role in the future of microgeneration in Ireland. This is reflected also in the document published by the Oireachtas Climate Change Committee recently. From our perspective, we assume that battery storage systems are likely to accompany rooftop solar PV to provide the capability to store electricity for times later in the day when it is needed in the home, or to supply the electricity grid when it's needed. One of the final points I would like to make to the committee relates to the potential impact on aspects relating to the electricity market through the increased use of microgeneration. Our understanding is that the payment for energy produced will be managed by the suppliers through the proposed minimum price tariff. This will require further discussion and with other key organisations such as ESB, the Commission for Energy Regulation, and indeed the Department for Communications, Climate Action and the Environment also. Okay.
You're finished. Thank you very much. I now invite Mr. Peter O'Shea from the ESB to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm joined this afternoon with Dr. Fergal McNamara, who's got a broad experience of energy policy in Ireland, in Great Britain and in Europe. Delighted to appear in front of the committee again and to share with you our perspectives on the bill. I suppose specifically I'd like to outline ESB's record in facilitating and supporting microgeneration to date. I'd like to draw attention to the EU's Clean Energy Package, which is expected to be Irish law by June 2021 and sets out the future regulatory framework for microgeneration. I'd like to give our observations on the microgeneration support scheme bill and finally just make some concluding comments. So if I start with our role, ESB has played a key role in facilitating that microgeneration to date, and indeed we launched a pilot programme in 2009 to kickstart the sector. We have two business units that play distinct roles. One is ESB Networks, responsible for the wires, and the second is Electric Ireland, responsible for retail sales. ESB Networks constructs and operates the distribution network to serve all 2.3 million customers in Ireland, regardless of their supplier. And ESB Networks determines the appropriate technical standards for equipment and puts in place the necessary commercial and safety procedures to enable the connection and operation of microgenerators. In ESB Networks play two roles. We connect microgenerators to the network, and that connection is free of charge. And just to be clear, the connection is free of incremental charge for the export component. And ESB Networks also provides and installs the import and export metering capability required to measure exported generation and collects and processes that meter data. As part of the pilot to kickstart the microgen sector, ESB Networks had a special microgeneration export tariff in place for 5 years, paying 10 cents for each kilowatt hour of exported electricity. On the other side of our business, Electric Ireland is responsible for retailing electricity to end-use customers, and to that end purchases wholesale electricity from a variety of sources, including from microgenerators. And as part of a pilot also, Electric Ireland pays a tariff of 9 cents per kilowatt hour for exported microgeneration. And I believe Electric Ireland is the only supplier in the marketplace to have offered such a tariff for microgenerators. There are approximately 700 microgenerators now availing of this microgeneration scheme tariff. So if I move now to the EU's Clean Energy Package, which sets out the regulatory framework for microgenerators, although it uses the broader headline of renewable self-consumers and is required to be law in Ireland by June 21, establishes a right for all renewable self-consumers to sell excess production of renewable electricity, and specifically the language of the law is member states shall ensure that renewable self-consumers, individually or through aggregators, are entitled to generate renewable electricity, including for their own consumption, store and sell their excess production of renewable energy, including through renewable power purchase agreements, electricity suppliers and peer-to-peer trading arrangements. The package goes on to give these renewable self-consumers the right to the market value of their electricity sold into the grid, and that's a very positive development. We believe that framework set out in the Clean Energy Package is sensible, as it sets out the rights for customers to self-generate and to have market access to sell any excess. The latter concept is well known to electricity markets and is often referred to as spill. In relation to the bill, we welcome it insofar as it provides a supportive environment for microgeneration and thereby engages customers and citizens in the energy transition, which we recognise how important that is. ESB supports putting in place all the measures that are required to provide market access to microgeneration as contemplated by the Clean Energy Package, and we address these measures a little bit later. However, we do note that there is a proposal in the bill to place a target on electricity suppliers to source no less than 5% of their requirements from microgeneration, and we don't support that particular, we don't support an arbitrary target. We think it should be considered. Microgeneration has a role to play, and in ESB's view, it is primarily to offset the import purchases by householders of electricity from the grid. The appropriate amount of microgeneration will naturally be established over time if proper wholesale market access is arranged. And that level could be 5%, or it could be higher than 5%, or it could be lower than 5%, depending on supply and demand. It's important to bear in mind that there are many other sources of renewable electricity and technologies, and that microgeneration is one of the highest priced sources according to SEAI data. For example, and if I can clarify the comments in our written submission, the data set indicates that microgeneration in the form of domestic rooftop solar is 2.5 times or 150% more expensive than offshore, large onshore, not offshore as mentioned in the paper. It's actually 70% more expensive than offshore and 25% more expensive than small-scale onshore. So the unintended consequences of intervention to set targets are well read and must be paid by someone. In this case, potentially other electricity customers, which would be a transfer. Subsidising micro-generated electricity exports above the wholesale market rate by establishing a volume obligation could lead to homeowners installing oversized rooftop photovoltaic panels to simply harvest the subsidy, something that's happened in other jurisdictions. In terms of measures that need to be taken in order to arrange market access and to prepare for the regulatory framework set out in the CEP, in the Clean Energy Package, there's 4 points I think need to be addressed. The first one is about definition. What is a microgenerator? It's important that we consider and agree an appropriate definition of the term microgeneration, and our written submission expands on the technical issues around this. In addition, the Clean Energy Package used the broader term renewable self-consumption rather than microgeneration, and it also includes some other categorisations. In relation to the bill, we therefore observe that the term microgeneration needs to be defined, specifying the technologies and the electrical power parameters, and take note of the language and the new categories in the Clean Energy Package. Secondly, in terms of metering, we need to measure the electricity exported. ESB networks will provide import-export metering at a regulated cost in the ordinary course. And in this context, it's interesting to note that smart meters will provide such import and export capability, and that a national rollout of smart meters is planned to commence in Q3 of this year. Thirdly, we need a mechanism to pay market value to microgeneration. The most practical means by which microgenerators, who for the most part will be domestic customers, to access the market would be for the supplier to provide a flow-through tariff, which transmits the market price directly. Of course, variations on this are possible. For example, average prices by time of day, etc., and can be a matter between suppliers and customers. And in this context, it is noteworthy that the Clean Energy Package requires Member States to ensure that such tariffs are actually made available. And finally, settlement processes are required. The microgenerator sells electricity to the supplier who purchases that electricity. The meter installed measures the quantity in each market time period, currently a half-hour period. This takes place across the entire country for every period of the year for every installation. There are advanced systems in place in the electricity market, but processes to cater for all of this domestic microgeneration will be required and will be need to integrate it into the wholesale market. So in conclusion, ESB is working to lead the change to a low-carbon future. Decarbonisation of the electricity system and the electrification of heat and transport are absolute keys to achieving a zero-carbon society and economy by 2050. We welcome the Microgeneration Support Scheme Bill 2017 insofar as it will enable and engage citizens directly in the energy transition in an appropriate, sustainable and cost-effective manner. We agree microgeneration absolutely has an important role to play in terms of this transition to a low-carbon society, but we're not in favour of the volume obligation being placed on suppliers contemplated in the current bill, and we believe would likely result in inappropriate subsidy for exported microgeneration. Instead, we believe the focus should be on providing market access for microgeneration, as we have outlined some of the issues that need to be addressed.
I now invite Mr Dudley Stewart from the Microelectricity Generation Association to make your opening statement.
The Microelectricity Association supports the proposal that microgeneration producing surplus power can receive a fair payment for energy exported to the grid. We believe that the community microgeneration or bottom-up microgeneration at a local level is what is needed and what should be supported at every level in order for Ireland to transition to the inevitable decentralised zero-carbon energy future. We believe citizens and energy groups are the gatekeepers to Ireland's energy transition and therefore should be central to decision-making and treated fairly with regard to payment for surplus energy, but also with regard to their full participation in this energy transition. We support the legislation as proposed when citizens and communities are also central to this. The proposed microgeneration support scheme must be mindful of the grid connection problem. The bill thus far does not take account of this as the barrier to community and microgeneration in Ireland. Microelectricity Generation Association is a not-for-profit research, development and incubation organisation involving active energy citizens, communities, local authorities, research institutes and both local and international energy companies. MEGA was formed during the consultation process in 2007. We are effectively an independent Irish energy research compact. Over a decade later, since the 2007 and more, We're still seeing growing public opposition and unrest to what is seen by many citizens as government inaction in relation to climate change. Mega rose out of this rising anti-renewables and anti-infrastructure opposition, protests and civil disorder. It recognised early that discontent arose out of decades of utility dominance and rising barriers to microgeneration, with citizens feeling cut off from critical energy solutions and future-proofing. There's growing frustration and anger among citizens globally and in Ireland due to the reality of climate change science and the impact being felt by those who have done the least to cause the problem. This frustration has taken to the streets as it did over a decade ago with recent climate action protests, including schools across the country, in the recent climate action strike on March 15, 2019. In order for this proposed legislation to have lasting impact and support citizens and all stakeholders in a bottom-up energy transition, there must firstly needs to be clarity on what microgeneration is and the positive socio-economic impact it has. The current outdated Irish government definition for microgeneration virtually excludes all cost-efficient microgeneration solutions. The European Parliament in 2013 defined microgeneration as generation for individual or own needs or for the needs of small to medium-sized enterprises, but also generation for communities for own use and small groupings such as cooperatives. This means it's not limited to the 25 amperes or 11 kilowatts that's considered to be microgeneration. And these are the least cost-effective areas and the least amenable to local collaboration. Mega unreservedly views microgeneration, in particular community microgeneration, as necessary in order for Ireland to meet its climate change targets and meet our commitments. The Microgeneration Support Bill 2017 must be mindful of this grid connection problem. The bill thus far has not taken this challenge into account, and we view this as the main barrier to microgeneration and community microgeneration in Ireland. The Microgeneration Support Bill 2017 will effectively allow more domestic customers to invest in microgeneration, as it will be more economically viable to make initial investments in renewable assets. Driving up the number of installations will attract competition and drive down to normal the costs of installations of micro-scale renewable energy system installations in Ireland. They are very high in comparison to anywhere else in Europe. Working to eliminate one of the issues long-term will be grid disturbance from microgeneration. Mega has spent a great deal of its decade developing solutions to grid disturbance challenge. Smart regional community energy systems are top on the list of Europe, and Ireland is recognised to be doing state-of-the-art research with the leading institutions in disturbance-free community energy resolutions. Regulated disturbance-neutral microgenerators will not suffer grid connection delays or obstacles. For this to happen, a new community system operator licensing system will be required. An additional investment is needed to focus on disturbance-neutral microgeneration solutions. This is extremely urgent and as important as feed-in tariffs or payment scheme for microgenerations and communities. These combined pioneering research and pilot projects will make Ireland a leader in the field of both renewable energy and smart grid deployment. This is urgent work of national strategic importance, deserving of better recognition and resourcing. We need to see more microgeneration going in, enable us to actually demonstrate what we're capable of in Ireland. There is a solution to ensure microgeneration a fair price for domestic microgeneration in Ireland becomes a reality. We envisage a future where communities and citizens take charge in securing their own energy futures through networks of community microgenerations supported by all key stakeholders. Microgrids and communities are the logical way towards a safe and balanced grid where local communities can contribute to the overall effort of zero carbon emissions, while also engaged in an undeniable trend of peer-to-peer economy. This is a universally worldwide thing. Smart Empower is rolling out systems here that are grid supportive and fully competitive, community driven. The energy transition to microgeneration will have a lasting impact on citizens of Ireland, ensuring energy security, energy reliance, resilience, whilst also driving economic growth. We are now living in a digitalised sharing economy where the future looks bright for community microgeneration and peer-to-peer energy trading and sharing. All stakeholders involved can benefit from this transition, and MEGA will support any legislation that this bill, if it supports a community-focused transition. Thank you. Got to be about halfway.
Thank you very much. I now call on Dr. Keith Sunderland. Thank you.
Let's start by thanking the opportunity to present here today. Research around topics concerning microgeneration is very rich. In general, and in the context of smarter energy environments, there is a recognition that for low voltage prosumers and other distributed sources such as electric vehicles, to derive benefits, the challenge is network architecture flexibility. This architecture needs to be sufficiently flexible to support a market for prosumers, but also sufficiently robust to accommodate the technical implications arising from the network contributions. Notwithstanding the research available, it is still very difficult to say definitively whether the measures being proposed by the bill will work for the Irish national interests. It should be noted at the onset that in avoiding CO2 emissions, there are cheaper alternatives to microgeneration. However, it is appropriate for policy decisions to acknowledge microgeneration as a contributor, as well as the environmental benefits created by social awareness of the technologies involved. Focus should therefore be on designing something that is economically efficient and socially equitable. With that in mind, my statement will examine some of the specifics proposed by the bill. Further consideration will also be offered around the technical implications and the importance of information and the resolution of other barriers relevant to the uptake of microgeneration. I have discussed the proposed bill with colleagues, principal investigators at TU Dublin, and my contribution to this meeting is reflective of research being undertaken at the Dublin Energy Lab, the Electrical Power Research Centre, and the Community Grid Project and Demonstrator, or CPAD project. If we consider the price arrangements, the price per kilowatt hour will be important in respect to how many and what types of households will be incentivised to invest in the scheme. Our research has shown that larger households with larger demand and likely to have higher incomes will benefit more from this scheme. From that point of view, and of both economic efficiency and equity, it would be worth considering multiple feed-in tariffs based on level of demand or the staged introduction of tariffs increasing over time. There is also the potential to use smart electricity or metering data as designed for individualised tariff regimes. It is generally acknowledged that lower capital costs of renewable energy systems is a requirement in making them more attractive to LV consumers. Decreases in solar PV levelised cost of energy is particularly reflective of those cost reductions and also cognizant of the advancements of the balance of systems. Ultimately, any economic analysis needs to be cognizant of the challenging or changing cost environment and future subsidy opportunities. It should also be pointed out that while the bill considers a range of microgeneration technologies, the dominant technology is still solar PV. Wind energy has seen technological improvements, but when planning restrictions and practical limitations are considered, this form of energy harvesting is challenging and its deployment is restricted to outside of population densities. In the context of supplier obligations, how the percentage concerning microgeneration contribution is to be calculated needs to be carefully considered. In other words, will it be on the basis of connected capacity or the number of households installations, or in respect to the quantity of electricity generated? If it is the latter, what level of generation capacity will be considered, i.e. will it have a time of use or seasonal impact consideration? Another relevant question concerns the energy quantification or the metering of the electricity produced. If the aggregated meter data reflects the electricity produced but does not account for the additional electricity produced and self-consumed on site, should the supplier obligation be calculated on what the meter shows and compliance determined based on what is exported? Or should it be calculated inclusive of what was consumed and compliance determined based on what was produced? Perhaps the latter is fairer and avoids market distortion, but this requires smart metering, which not only meters import and export, but also on-site production. The addition of communities in the bill is welcomed. Communities organising themselves into energy communities to produce electricity can not only improve the return on investment through economies of scale, it would also make microgeneration more manageable and the electricity market as a whole. TU Dublin refers to such organised communities as community grids. It is imperative, however, that the combined financial net benefits to the community grid is sufficiently larger than the combined benefits if each member was to invest individually. A mechanism, therefore, should be found that values and assigns to the community grid the benefits that they will bring to the electricity market. The technical implications associated with microgeneration involve system impacts and environmental benefits. The bill has the potential for significant technical implication. The widespread deployment of embedded generation could cause significant fluctuations in the demand for electricity at a national system level. This will be happening at the same time as we continue to promote large-scale wind using intermittent renewable energy technologies. This could lead to greater risks to the system instability and possible power quality concerns. Work will be needed to undertake, to ensure that the necessary knowledge and systems are in place to adapt to this new challenge. But these significant evidence-based analysis and assessment requirements are challenges or research opportunities. They include network resilience to the modern-day consumer requirements, particularly with an increased proliferation of electrical vehicles, the complementarity of electrical vehicles, where strategies to match charging demand in respect to microgeneration support are required. Demand-side response and management systems, again, complementarity processes where smart systems can be included to organise load and generation for effective consumer engagement. Resource appreciation understanding, including enhanced models for solar PV, wind resource and energy harvesting techniques for domestic scales, where modelling for installation and cloud cover, as well as energy mapping, are needed. And ultimately, network support mechanisms, including initiatives to include storage options and network voltage support requirements. From an environmental perspective, the net life cycle benefits of the microgeneration technologies chosen for the support scheme should also be assessed and appropriate technologies screened out. For example, a recent study of household-level gas-fired micro-CHP system found that some technologies result in increased emissions when replacing conventional gas boilers, I should say. It is unclear why micro-CHP is being supported when these almost always use non-renewable fossil fuels. Marginal abatement cost assessment should be carried out on the preferred microgeneration technologies so that those with reduced emissions at lowest cost are prioritised for support. In respect to information, not all microgeneration technologies are suitable for deployment in all situations, and many will significantly underperform both economically and in terms of carbon emissions abatement if they are not matched to the correct dwelling type and location. Careful thought and matching technologies designed with end-use siting is therefore required in a manner that is accessible to the wider population, while at the same time informing of the technical capabilities and performance inhibitors. It is imperative that the necessary information for end-user decision-making is available and widely disseminated. Economic performance is not only a barrier to uptake of microgeneration technologies. For example, a study undertaken at the Dublin Energy Lab established that homeowners worry about the reliability of microgeneration, are concerned about the disruption caused by fitting technologies to their dwellings, and have technology-specific concerns, for example, reaction of neighbours and local residents, for example, with respect to wind turbines. Moreover, there are process and management logistics involved. With the level of microgeneration advocated by the bill, what about grid access, connectivity and the logistics and competencies issues associated with them? To connect to the network, registered electrical contractors perform what is termed controlled works, and certification of the installation is required. While this is a technical requirement, there are regulation considerations and financial burdens involved. Furthermore, the process is governed by an inform and fit connection process managed by ESB networks. Should there be a significant proliferation of microgeneration, there will be logistical implications for the network operator to manage. These administration issues, while not insurmountable in their own right, are relevant to the management of the technical implications that will become manifest. As such, will require a more stringent management process, at least until smart meters become mainstream. In summary, therefore, microgeneration contributes to wider environmental benefits, but is not the cheapest form of CO2 emission avoidance technique or system. Multiple feed-in tariffs based on level of demand or a staged introduction of tariffs should be considered. More consideration is warranted in respect to the supplier obligation piece and how this is to be equitably apportioned. Community-based initiatives are welcomed in general, but consideration is required to ensure net benefits are available to the community grid. There will be a number of technical considerations with increased microgeneration proliferation, and they should be conflated with current issues concerning e-mobility and demand-side management. It is imperative that relevant and accessible information is widely available and it covers the spectrum of considerations involved. The barriers to microgeneration, including societal and logistical, need further consideration in terms of a synergetic microgeneration scheme to be transparent and equitable. These concerns described above should be considered when assessing the likely success of the scheme and the likelihood of meeting policy targets. I would like to thank the committee again.
Thank you very much. And I'll now bring in the sponsor of the bill, Deputy Brian Stanley.
Yes, thanks very much, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming in and for giving their time to Liam from Eirgrid and Peter and the panel from the ESB, Dudley, Microgeneration Association and Keith from TU. Your observations on the bill are very welcome. The bill is an attempt to try and get in place a legislative structure and framework for allowing microgeneration in this country. I'm aware that the ESB have operated a pilot project, and some of us may have questions around that, Peter. You know how that, the strengths and weaknesses of that, maybe and difficulties you come up against, and successes in that. You know, I outlined in the bill that there's a number of ways that microgeneration can take place, and I think a course is accepted that solar will be obviously will be a major part of that. But being having a large rural areas in our country, I think that, you know, wind and small scale wind may also be a considerable part of it, and indeed, you know, there may be other forms as well, you know, in terms of being connected with agriculture. Small scale hydro, we don't believe has reached its potential. We tend to have a lot of water, except for a few months in the middle of last year, where we didn't have too much water, but we didn't need much electricity. But when we do need a lot of electricity, we tend to have an awful lot of water in winter and in the wet seasons. So, you know, that's an area that we think needs to be examined further. We do have the need for a minimum price tariff, and we have left us a lot of flexibility in terms of that. The Minister shall draft the regulations that may be revised, which will contain the minimum contractual price, the minimum length of the contractual term for the tariff, and the Minister may amend the applicable microgeneration bill regarding equipment and equipment's capacity. The 5% I know has been raised. Electricity suppliers under the bill must supply 5% of their electricity from microgen by 2025, and I note that a couple of the contributors raised that, and you're right to do so, because we want to hear if you have difficulties with that. Certainly, I'm not that rigid about that, and the party that I represent is not that rigid about it either. You know, it's a second stage bill. We believe that we have flexibility there in terms of what we do with it. But the question was asked: was it 5% of suppliers, or was it 5% of the electricity, the volume? It's 5% of the volume of electricity supplied should be from microgeneration by 2025. The idea, I suppose, in putting in a target is that if you don't set targets, things tend not to happen. People say, sure, I will reach it some other time, you know, and the climate change applications, I suppose, would be a good example of that, you know, where we said, you know, I will leave that now for another year or two, you know, but it's an attempt to try and move things on, I suppose. Just a couple of questions, I suppose. Can I just put for brevity, just the simplest way of doing it, Cathaoirleach, with your permission, just in relation to, you know, in the Eirgrid contribution, you know, you outlined, Liam, that, you know, we do need more renewables. You raised the question about the 5% target that would make up a large proportion of our electricity renewable supply on a sunny day, and that would be a challenge. But you also mentioned, you know, that with the increasing technology around battery, you know, that may act as a counterbalance there, and you might just give a reply on that about maybe examples of where that is being got around. The ESB, similar to Peter mentioned, you know, in relation to the 5% target. The pilot that you're running, I think, is very, very exciting, Peter. You have 700, I think 700 signed up to it, which is very, very impressive. It is a bit more expensive. You might just flesh out how much more expensive. What's the big problems you come up against with the pilot, and I suppose what's the potential success of it? And just to also ask, I suppose, particularly Eirgrid and the ESB, about which is just slightly off the bill, the subject here, you might refer to it, microgen for self-consumption. In terms of the Microgeneration Association, and thanks very much, Dudley, for your presentation. He said that the main problem was with connection to the grid and to markets, and we're hearing that off people who are trying to do it. What do you think we need to do there to get around that? And maybe have you any examples internationally about how you break through that? And lastly then, just around the presentation from Keith, the fluctuation in supply. Now, it's my understanding that there was one period during a very windy period back about 2 years ago where nearly 70% of our electricity came from wind, came from renewables. And I'm just wondering if we're able to do that. And the experts will tell us that the grid is okay with 60% renewable, 65% renewables. With the small share that Microgen would be making up, why would that cause a problem at this stage? If the, because we're told we have internationally, and ESB will tell us this, and it's good news. I think Peter has told me this in the past in more informal meetings that that by international standards we have a very good grid, and compliments everybody to our grid and everyone for doing that, modernising it. So it was my understanding that our grid would not be thrown off balance by a very modest amount of microgeneration. And the other thing we're curious about is that countries like Germany and other northern European states where there's not an awful lot of sun, maybe fairly similar type weather patterns and that, they seem to be able to have wide-scale microgeneration. What's the big difference? Why can't we do it here? Thanks.
Senator O'Reilly, who I know has to go to the chamber, the Shannon chamber, after just with questions. You might just hold on to those questions from Deputy Stanley, and I'll bring in Senator O'Reilly.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for accommodating me in this way. And just to say to our guests, of course, you're extremely welcome, and we're delighted that you're here to make your presentations, which were very, very interesting. And I would ask our guests, I would like to thank you, but I would ask your forbearance in that I will leave, but I will read your responses to my comments, and because I am interested, and the people I represent are very interested in this question, so I will be reading more detail on it. I also want at the outset to congratulate our colleague here, Deputy Stanley, on his inputs and his interest, and I think that's a great thing in the committee, and I think it should be acknowledged. I want just to raise or stroke 5 questions, stroke comments, if I might. And insofar as I lack technical knowledge or technical detail, I would appreciate your understanding of that, and you can elaborate on that in layman's terms insofar as that's necessary in response. I suppose the big thing, I should state an interest. I'm a huge believer in microgeneration myself, and I think it's the way forward, and I think it's the way forward on an enormous number of fronts. But one of the big things is that if people are involved with microgeneration, it gives them buy-in to the entire carbon reduction project. They get an ownership of the project. It becomes their project, and they feel a pride in what they've done for it. It's then their project, and they start to put moral pressure on others, and they start to feel a right to speak on it, and they expand their involvement with it from that position of their own tentative steps in it. They then go further into it, and it becomes a whole lifestyle thing for them. And that's why I think microgeneration and the support of it is crucial. I'm personally very interested in the idea too. I know there wasn't a lot of focus given to you, and you did talk about its expensiveness and the planning difficulties, but I'm personally very interested in the micro-generated wind, small wind turbines and their potential, because I compared them to the creameries at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, that the local creamery became a focal point for the regeneration of communities and for modernisation of agriculture, modernisation of society, and was very important in our whole societal evolution here. I similarly see that at this critical time now that we could have small wind turbines in communities, owned by communities, and them supported in the ownership of them. I personally, I'd like a comment on this. I believe that that could have a crucial educational value, buy-in value, and I'd like a comment on that. The big problem I see, and I'd like further comment on this, is that there's been a slow financial returns for microgeneration, that people don't like the idea that it would take 7 years to free up the cost of their solar panels, so on and so on, that the slow return is a problem. And I do take the point that the more useful, the more use, then it will drive down the cost, the more production of the units, the costs fall, and that's why we have to try to achieve that. But how do the panels and various speakers think we can keep it attractive while capping? You did make the point that there would have to be a capping of output, that no one person could sort of exploit the whole thing or use their output wrongly. But I'm not so sure that there's a big need there. But could you explain that capping thing and how the level of use that a family could take from microgeneration, or indeed a community, and then the level that they could get money from? Because between reducing the price of the inputs and reducing or increasing the return to consumers, that's the way you get buy-in. That's the way you get people to want them and make them attractive. And if you could comment on all that goes on, where would you think the capping level would be to make it attractive? And what about explain the minimum price tariff, if you would, a little more to me, and what would you suggest would be an adequate minimal price? It has to be viable, it has to be attractive. And if you think of the fines we'll avoid in broad terms, and you think of the societal benefits, I think it's a no-brainer to try to do this. I'd like you to comment on the grid connection problems and how they might be overcome. I think full stop. There's no need for elaboration there. I'm interested in the thing coming from the county and the area that I come from, and from Cavan, Monaghan, that area. We have a lot of intensive agriculture in that area, and it's a very important facet of our landscape, our economic landscape and our social landscape. And I would like to know about the digesters that could arise from intensive agricultural production, how those digesters could become a source of microgeneration, if you like, and how the energy could come into the grid from them, and how money could return to those people. And there's a whole huge set of benefits there. And insofar as I'm lacking in technical knowledge around that, or indeed knowledge of best practices, please understand that. All I can say is that the people that I represent in that area would have enormous benefit if they could have digesters, and if those digesters could be economically viable with all the good output. And the last point I'd like, and I will have to leave then because of the other, and I appreciate this, Madam Chair, because it's important to me to get these things said. The last point I'd like to raise is the linkage between waste management and microgeneration, like waste management of the individual household, waste management of the community, county waste management. And there should be a natural link here, a very big link in my view, because it's a way of overcoming two problems at the one time. And I'd just like responses to that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I know there's a lot of questions there, so what I might do is let you come in as you want, and if anyone wants to come in, and I know some of you were named, but if any of you want to come in on any of the questions between Deputy Stanley's and Senator O'Reilly, and if Deputy Ryan is okay to wait for this round, I'll come to you after. Who would like to come in on any of those questions that were addressed to them? Okay.
In relation to the question from Deputy Stanley, just in relation to the 5% and concerns that we actually have, is that, and we're making the assumption that the solar rooftop will be the main contributor to give us that 5%. And therefore, when we take a capacity factor in, which is roughly 10% of the installed capacity, what we actually see is that to meet the 5% average over a yearly time frame, that the majority of that will be made up, in particular during the sunny days that we actually have. So during those days, we have done the calculations that we have done. We are seeing that to make that average of 5% over that period in time would indicate that we would need to have installed 2 gigs. And on a really sunny day, when all that capacity has been put onto the system, we have only a reduced amount of consumption, because in the sunny days we're not absorbing as much, or we're not demanding as much electricity. And during those days, we would see about 3.5 gigs. So, however, we have in the past had similar challenges. So we've successfully, as an industry and as a community, we have installed 65% of our energy can be made from renewables at the moment. So this is another challenge that we just have to overcome. And key to that will be storage. So that during a sunny day, when if you have complementary between the solar in particular and the battery storage, that people can store the excess generation from their homes and use that for later on to supply into the grid when it's actually needed. And that way it's a more holistic solution of doing that. And that's how we believe would be more complementary to make this more effective and efficient, and allow for the greater penetration of renewables to get to the 75% instantaneous that we're looking for into the future, and then also to even have an average of much higher than the 40%, and maybe get to 70 and even higher in the future. Okay.
Response to your question as well as how have they done this in other jurisdictions, and why is it a problem potentially for Ireland? It comes back to what has just been said. It's the scale of penetration. Research, there's limited research that has looked at the complementarity, to follow on the theme, how to complement peak demand, not just demand, but the fluctuation and the high frequency fluctuation against the actual storage capabilities. So studies concerning how EV can work in complement with the actual generation are required. I was lucky enough to be involved in a German-Irish Chamber of Commerce visit to Germany, and following on from your point, and they have a significant amount of PV generation in the south, and they have a lot of wind in the north. And at some points of the year, they could have 50% of their requirements in solar PV at one time. And they have, a well-established place such as Germany, they have issues with balancing it. So it's the high frequency, it's the complementarity of the storage, and it's the ability to be able to capture that at optimal times for people to use and when they want to use it.
Do you want to come in, Peter?
Please, yeah. I'll ask my colleague, Dr. McNamara, short just talk about the clean energy package, because I think it captures a lot of the issues that have been raised in the various questions. We've gone around microgeneration and beyond. Just maybe to say, you know, it's very clear we're moving from an electricity system which right now comprises a small number of very big pieces to one which will be a large number of very small pieces. That's the direction of travel. And microgeneration is a key part of that. And there are several technologies. I suppose probably the most prominent one right now, in response to the Senator, is solar rooftop. And that in part is down to the building regulations. And again, it is going to be part of the overall mix that we will need to manage. In terms of our current scheme, and we launched it probably nearly 10 years ago now, Deputy. And yes, there are 700 odd microgenerators on that scheme. It's costing Electric Ireland well over €100,000 a year to operate that scheme. And the reason it needs to be looked at is it's not scalable in its current form, right? It's not scalable. It needs to be integrated commercially into the market arrangements, but also needs to be integrated technically within the system. But look, it's been a scheme which has done what it said on the tin, in that it has kick-started microgeneration in Ireland. And I think the last time we were here back in September, I wrote to the committee afterwards just to explain a little bit more about the microgeneration and where electrons go when they go from one house to another house. So when the electrons come off the solar panel, if they're not consumed in the house, what happens to them and who pays for them? And it gets very complex quite quickly, but those complexities have got to be dealt with. We've got to understand those complexities, and we've got to develop the set of market rules to address that. In terms of the overall capability and the cap that the Senator mentioned, if you put a volume obligation on suppliers, then the price paid for export will at times be in excess of the value of that excess electricity to the system and to the supplier who's receiving it. And there'll be times as well where it's of greater value. So when in the middle of the summer, if demand is down, well then the value of solar excess might be low. So it's important just to recognise that and then ask, well, so the reason for the cap is, the reason why we don't favour putting that obligation on suppliers is that it does create a subsidy between different classes of customers, and ultimately that subsidy needs to be paid for by somebody. It could be paid for through a PSO, which is a very explicit means of moving money from one bunch of customers to another bunch of customers. It could be paid for through cross-subsidies and tariffs, which I don't think anybody would particularly want, or be paid from the exchequer. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but there are difficulties with it. In terms of the digesters the Senator mentioned, there was a report done by SEAI back in 2015, I think updated in 2017, looking at biogas, which I think is what the Senator is speaking to. Biogas can be created by taking slurry and grass from Agriculture Ireland, creating biogas, maybe updating that biogas or upgrading that biogas to biomethane, and then you could potentially inject that biomethane into the grid system as renewable gas, or you could burn it in a CHP, which may well be a micro-generator if it's below a certain level of capacity. So I think there's certainly there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of potential there. The SAI report reckoned that Ireland could meet 28% of its gas needs through that biogas production by 2030, and that half of that biogas would be used to power electricity CHP plants, and half would be upgraded to biomethane and injected into the grid system. So I might pass to Dr. McNamara now to comment on the CEP.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I've just returned from Brussels, where I was working for more than 2 years on this clean energy package, and if it pleases you, I could put some brief remarks on the record about it and what it means in this context. It is, of course, Europe's response to the 2030 climate and energy targets, which we signed up to pursuant to the Paris Agreement. And one of the really interesting things that are in there is the effort by the lawmakers to engage the customers in the energy transition. And customers are the same thing almost as citizens, in whose name this transition is being affected and who are the ones that will be ultimately paying for it. So there's a lot of things in the clean energy package to try to kickstart and enable those customers. And the very passages that my colleague Peter read out are appropriate here in terms of the renewable self-consumers. Other things that you'll see in there are citizens' energy communities, and they have been mentioned. And the key question here is to how to allow the customers to participate in the transition so that they can have that sense of involvement that the Senator spoke about, but also the sense of control and indeed the sense of delight in reducing their own energy consumption. And the key issue there is market access and how consumers could achieve at least the market price for any excess that they have in relation to microgeneration production on their premises, above and beyond that which they consume themselves. So I think that's really important. The only other thing I wanted to say was also in the Renewable Energy Directive there are some requirements in relation to speeding up, streamlining and giving guarantees around the connection process. So we have a particular issue with that in Ireland, of course, because we've got the planning, permitting process to go through as well as the grid connection process. So the Clean Energy Package is very positive in terms of this, and I think any measures, the bill in fact could be framed in that wider context, and it will be, or is expected to be transposed into Irish law by June 2021. Thank you very much.
Dudley Stewart.
Yeah, hi. Great, thanks. So many of the points raised by Brian and Debbie Wallace are actually taken up in this paper here with regard to grid connections. I think the main issue here is if we see microgeneration as being tiny little microgenerations for individuals, we're looking at the most costly technology. It's costly because if you don't have the services to serve that kind of area, you're going to have high costs. What everywhere in the world has done, it has pushed to get the technology deployment up so that the services go down in costs and your overall technology goes down in costs. But that brings it also to the European definition of microgeneration, which is community generation for own use. So that's not tiny generation, that's biogas digesters, that's micro-hydro, that's small-scale hydro, that's a wide range of different energy sources that we have in Ireland that can't be exploited at the moment because they're not really recognised as being micro-generation. They're seen as being purely commercial generation, and therefore they have to take a line in the queue like wind power projects designed by developers. And you know, frankly, you could wait 5 years or even more to get interactive studies to get a grid connection for any of that stuff. If microgeneration is in accordance with the European definition, microgeneration could give as much as 25 to 30% of Ireland's. So I agree with Deputy Wallace that this is a much kind of underestimated potential. And also it's a potential for exactly what was said there, unifying communities, community resilience, for bringing people together. And this can be built around the whole problem of how you balance power and how you actually deal with these wandering electrons, as they say, using the foremost developments in digital technology. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. But if Ireland as a country wants to actually solve this problem, we need to work together, but not play together. We need to work together seriously. And we're not seeing that now. We've been in the field. We're a multi-group. We represent active citizens, communities, academia, local authorities, working hard in this area, but we're not seeing the enthusiasm from the utilities that's needed for us to actually really harness this fabulous resource. So that we're not talking about 5%, we're talking about 30%. We're talking about more of our citizens and our businesses being involved, with a wider diversity of sources. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Eamon Ryan, I'm bringing you in now.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a hugely important debate and something we need to get right quickly. Mr. Ryan, I suppose just to start with yourself there, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action has just agreed, or proposals launched today, that we would set ourselves a renewable electricity target of 70% by 2030, which is not unambitious. We're going to be testing the edge of the envelope. I think maybe a lot of that was influenced by some of the study that Baringa did for the IWEA, setting out how that might work. I think, if I'm going on memory here, something like estimated an additional 5.5 gigawatts. I think it's all island maybe on this, so we have to be careful, of wind, largely offshore, I would imagine. I think they estimated an additional 2.5 gigawatts of solar. And I think they estimated 1.8 gigawatts of battery storage was what Baringa were assessing would work on our network. I suppose the political question is whether we do that solar, just take that, because I think I agree first of all with Dudley that I think there's a whole range of microgeneration open to us, but solar is the one where we're most potential to grow, it seems to me. Have EirGrid done any corresponding analysis? And given that the government have already, they said, committed publicly, I think, that they are going to raise the target to 70%, have you done any similar analysis as to how, in your perspective, to maintain a stable grid, a 70% target might be bet? What sort of solar do you estimate in that, if we have that target, what would be the optimal solar component within that? Just for 2030, and we're going beyond there, obviously. But.
So we've done some studies around this, and it is, I think we're aligned around the 2 gig number for solar coming onto the system. Key around this is it has to be complemented with, so at the moment we've pushed the barrier and pushed the envelope to get to the 65% renewable instant penetration. And we will push that further in the coming year or so to get that up to the 75%. And to push it to have an average of 70% is a challenge that we need to, and we'll work our way through it. And renewables and solar will form a key part of it. The 2 gigs is a reasonable estimation to achieve that target. And how that actually happens, whether it comes from the larger solar farms or from domestic, we're very much open to that from an EirGrid perspective. Key that we need to be able to do is how we actually control and manage that energy as it comes on, and that we're storing it and that we can use it at the appropriate times. Because there's going to be times like where we will have a lot of solar and we will actually have a lot of other types of renewables coming onto the system at the same time, but we will only have a certain amount of demand. Part of the solution will be interconnection, where we export the excess at points in time, or we import at some other times. So there has to be a holistic solution to make this actually happen. So we are now starting on the journey of trying to work on what the steps we need to do to be able to make that new targets a reality. And we believe we will be able to find the solutions to it and work our way through it.
Okay. And I should have said at the start, congratulations. I understood we hit 63% on Monday, which is probably a record, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is some feat, and we're going beyond it. But just to, politically, from the political perspective, there is huge advantage in favouring rooftop, not just domestic, but farming, business, but for that sense of ownership and engagement in this transition. But I would put it another way, is there not also, and this maybe is now down at the distribution level, so maybe it doesn't affect your transmission system, but the whole system has to integrate now. Is there not a huge advantage in really strengthening the distribution network, in the sense that what government is also going to commit to do, if they heed our report, is to go to this massive ramping up of retrofit of housing? You know, at least 50,000 houses a year deep retrofit, and deep retrofit has to include heat pump and an EV charging point.
Yeah.
If we achieve that, let's say 50,000 a year for the next 10 years, so we've 500,000 heat pumps now. And my understanding, when you get down to the distribution level, that the management of this on a street level, where you've got 15-volt boxes and controlling access at each in-house, it's incredibly difficult to manage some of that distribution level material. But is there not a huge advantage in the rooftop solution in bringing a lot of the solutions back to the local level rather than putting such pressure on the transmission grid? If we try and do it all in the transmission system, I just don't see it's going to work.
Yeah, no, I agree that we need to maximise the penetration onto the distribution system. Because if we can meet the local demand that's required by actually having local microgeneration, that will mean that we should be able to invest less in the transmission system. However, there is going to be a counter to that, is that we also need to invest in the local storage as well, because otherwise what will actually tend to happen is that electricity is a perishable commodity, and therefore if we don't actually have a way of storing or keeping it locally, at times when when wind or renewables is not actually providing, we need to be able to get the power to the communities and into those local areas. So I believe that there will be the grid, the overall transmission grid will definitely need to change and evolve, and EirGrid are very much looking at what is the right solution, knowing the scenarios that we're investigating and looking at. And from a distribution level, I'm probably going to hand over to my colleagues in ESB to talk about the distribution side, but definitely there's huge benefits from an EirGrid perspective.
Just before we go on to that, and I agree firstly with one thing you said there very much, I think we need massive interconnection to help us when we're at that 70% penetration level. It's a huge sense for us to have that flexibility, not just the line to France, but also additional, which I prefer to see as EirGrid owned, so that the transmission system is a public asset, but significant additional number of interconnectors to give us that capability. Just again, I'm sorry, this is straying slightly away from my generation, but it is all connected. Has EirGrid done a needs base which shows that we need large numbers of new gas-fired combined cycle gas plants in this scenario where we have 70% renewables penetration? How would you see that as being essential? And if we were doing interconnection and if we're achieving 70% renewables, do we need many additional gas plants?
I'm going to turn to my colleague here, who's probably closer to it.
Yeah, we're not seeing an increase in the amount of gas required in the system, but the makeup of those plants and the number of them may change. Like in recent auctions, there's been a number of new, smaller gas plants successful. So I think that the makeup of the gas portfolio will change out to 2030. Beyond that, I think a lot depends on what happens with the gas and renewable gas and power to gas and other technologies which may play a part, and the coupling between electricity and gas out over the next 20 years.
Okay.
Decarbonise the system.
So not additional, but maybe slightly more responsive until the gas. Can I ask Peter from the ESB? I read recently in the Irish Times, I think it was front page story, the ESB want to build a whole load of new gas plants to serve Dublin.
Sorry, just ask Peter to address the question.
Okay. If I can answer that question first.
In relation to the grid, the question.
I'll come on to that if I can ask just the gas one first, because it is connected in terms of the overall system.
Firstly, when you look at the generation adequacy statement, right, and like the document produced this year or last year outlines potential 57% increase in demand in the Republic of Ireland over the next 10 years. So that's a bigger rate of increase than we've ever seen before in Ireland. So I think we need to be prudent about it. And like we have developed options around open cycle gas turbines. We have won a number of options within the capacity mechanism. So, we're keeping various options open because I think that the level of uncertainty about where demand goes and what the requirements are is significant. But certainly flexibility is a key part of it. Because
I won't labour the point, but we've just heard from EirGrid that there isn't necessarily, the adequacy statement may be changing if we do further interconnection and as we get higher renewables penetration and battery storage ramps up. Those out-of-date adequacy statements maybe shouldn't drive investment decisions. And that what ESB is saying in public, and it's hoarding down on Marion Street at the moment, is it's all about the distribution system. It's all about, as you say, thousands and tens of thousands of generation points rather than more 400 megawatt.
It's a large number of small things is what the future is about, rather than a small number of large things. And I think, again, in the recent auctions, we've won the rights to build lots of battery technology. So, we're looking at ocean wind, onshore wind. We've entered agreement with Oriel. We've entered agreements for the Galloper wind farm in the UK. We're looking at a whole range of different options on the renewable side. But there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the overall outcome will be. Can I just come back to the previous question? Because the way I characterise the network issues that we're facing, upstream and downstream, right? So upstream, it's all about how you can manage what is an intermittent resource and getting it onto the network so they can actually feed downstream to customers. And EirGrid, I'm on the record saying this, have done a super job in that space over the last 5-7 years in getting the intermittency up to a 65% level. And I think the 70-30 target that is emerging, that's 70% on average, right? So to get 70% on average electricity from intermittent sources on the grid system will probably require, now these guys will know better, but it'll probably require 90% plus intermittency at any particular point in time. And again, that's a major challenge, and I've no doubt that we'll get there in time. But it is a big challenge. The other big challenge in the network then, having solved that piece upstream, is to come downstream and sort of reflect the fact that we believe electrification of transport and heat will add a fair amount onto the overall demand for electricity over the period. So how do you get more of the juice from upstream, downstream, through the existing cables, the existing wires, the existing transformation capacity? And that's the challenge that our distribution business faces. And that's all about, that there is investment required in additional transformation capacity, in additional cabling, additional wires, but also investment in smart technologies to try and even out the demand over the course of the day so that the existing capacity can be used better.
No, I would agree fully. I think that the great job EirGrid has done, I'm sure will be matched by the amazing job ESB is about to do by being one of the leading distribution companies in the world in managing this. Because what Dudley says is true. We have an economic opportunity, and it is all about digital. And by setting such a high target and being pretty much the leading country in the world, which would that put us in the place of, we would do the learning by doing, which would be of great benefit to this country in a whole variety of ways. Just go back, if I can, to that question I asked Liam. When it comes down to the distribution system, take my street, where an electric vehicle is going to take off like a rocket in the next few years. The 2 charging points outside are full up at the moment. I was thinking to myself, they're only there a few months, and we're going to have to quadruple more, 10 times the number of AV charging points in our own car park here. Because if you came in today to get your charging point, you couldn't get it in the Oireachtas car park. Going back to that technical issue I mentioned, I'm not an expert engineer, but I understand that currently the distribution system, if we've, let's say, my terraced row of houses, 4 houses, I have a heat pump in mine, I will be getting an electric charging point, and my neighbours will be doing the same. Managing that actually at the local level is not a small, that's a difficult thing for the existing distribution system. It requires a complete reorientation of how we do it. A lot of it involving sending signals to switch things on and off. So we're not charging all 4 cars at the one time. So we're not running all 4 heat pumps at the one time. So we're maybe using battery storage in all those houses and so on. But in this scenario, if that's where it's going, which it seems to me where it is going, surely then the existence of rooftop solar on those houses provides a major beneficiary in the armoury of the distribution. It's not seen as now, oh God, you're taking the power market away from us, or you're undermining your neighbours. Far from it. It's an integral part of the solution of what any good distribution company is going to have to do. Rooftop solar is a huge friend to you in this incredible task we have ahead. Would you agree with that?
I'd agree, Deputy. I sometimes ask myself the question, is rooftop solar, is it a generation asset because it generates electrons? Is it a network asset in that it would offset potentially some network investment? Or is it a supply asset in that suppliers generally are the people out there promoting rooftop solar? So I think that's separation of the industry that we've seen for the last 15, 20 years. I think at the edge, that is starting to meld back together again. So I would actually agree with that assessment.
Okay. Can I think
if I just finish, in ESB Networks, they would have launched an innovation strategy around 24 months ago now, looking at a whole stream of different projects and research and development in order to get ahead of the curve in terms of the sort of issues that you're raising there. And one example of that is the programme we're running down in Dingle, which is all about how do we integrate all of these technologies in a particular geographic location to try and get more throughput in the networks in a manner that is sustainable, in a manner that's cost effective, and a manner that's secure.
No, I think that's a really welcome development. And
To come in on that, do you mind?
if I can just finish with the ESB and then I'll come back to you. No, I think it's a really good example of learning by doing, and Kerry people are smart. They'll surely set us in the right course. Can I ask, the other advantage we have on this is, as you say in your own submission, that what we're proposing in terms of what Deputy Stanley is proposing in an appropriate, in my mind, ambition for microgeneration is also backed up by European Clean Energy Package and so on. When do you expect, if, as you say, that the package says we have to have this legislation for by 2021, when do you think will we wait until 2021 or should we start this before then? In terms of having, particularly in regard to the further quote you mentioned from the CEP, that renewable self-consumers to receive remuneration, including where applicable to support schemes for self-generated that feed into the grids, which reflects the market value of that electricity. When do you think that will be available to Irish customers?
Well, I think it's the 4 issues I list at the back of the submission. Probably the single biggest one is being able to measure the output, and ESB Networks will provide meters as and when they are required for microgenerators. And the second one then is ensuring that the outputs from those meters can be integrated into the business processes, which is effectively determined by a number of different parties, the CRU, the department, Airgrid, ESB Networks, ensuring that framework is in place so you can scale it up. Because if you recall the last session we had here back in September, the difficulty right now is if you export electricity from a microgenerator, it results in a reduction in the technical losses on the network rather than providing value to any individual supplier. So we need to actually make sure we join up all the regulations around that space in order to give effect to it.
As you say, and I remember I was Energy Minister at the time, we did introduce in 2009 the pilot scheme to learn. So we've been doing this for 10 years. I mean, the last government stopped it, but there was that period of a number of years where we were doing it. So can I ask one other question of ESB and then I'll come back to Mr. Sutherland. What do you think, following that the Clean Energy Package, saying that we should have a price which reflects the market value of electricity, what do you think that price should be and how should it operate?
I think it should be the wholesale price of electricity. Right. So on average right now, the wholesale price is probably around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But at periods and that's on average across the day. So that price would be influenced by a low price at night and a high price during the day. And it's during the day when the sun shines. So if you go with the wholesale price of electricity through ISEM, through the SEM programme, it will result in a price somewhere north of 5 cents a megawatt hour, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's the price which reflects the value of the electricity on the system at any point in time.
It's another difficulty that if we do get up to the levels we're talking about, and God, we're so far away from it that it's not any time soon, but there's an underlying kind of difficulty in the whole development of renewables that they always bring down the wholesale price. Even in Ireland, it applies with the wind at the moment, but it could eventually apply where you have a high, very sunny day. It would kill the very incentive for the.
I think that's a real issue, not just in microgeneration. I think it's an issue for the markets, right? And it's an issue which, at European level, with the CEP, they'll be looking to address over a period, because a new market design will be required to reflect that.
Dr. Sunderland, I'll bring you in next. And then Dudley, I'll just bring Dr. Sunderland first. Is that okay? I'll bring you in next then.
No, just in reaction to a point you made about the complication at your street and how to manage from a network perspective. But if you look at it in the context of the consumer or the prosumer and the aggregation opportunities, but the complexities associated with them, there's a demand-side response element to this. So there's an intelligence at the consumer end that looks to optimise the storage vis-à-vis the actual generation. But also something that wasn't really touched on too much, there's the whole vehicle-to-grid opportunities that are there potentially as well, where the grid actually can be supported by the EV. This is research that people are looking at, but they haven't gone too far in it as yet. But it's an issue not just for the grid or the network, it's also for the prosumer as well.
Mr. Stewart.
One question for Mr. Stewart, if I can ask him before he comes in.
Yeah.
Because I think what he said is very true in terms of this digital revolution and so on. An example that has been shown to work, in my mind, best in the sort of community aggregated supply and generation side is a Dutch company, or a Belgian rather, EcoPower, based in the Flemish part of. And the attractive thing about them is they aggregate individual shareholders, can be as low as €250 a share, to be able to put in some of the larger microgeneration, or even other generation assets you might want to put in. But also they act as a supply company, providing just the sort of innovative demand management services that Mr. Sutherland just talked about, switching things on and off. And I agree with you that this aggregated community cooperative model seems to be the really one with huge potential to ramp things up at scale, because it's hard for any individual householder to engage in this. Can I ask you, I mean, I'm familiar with and hugely supportive of the work you're doing in Tala and the smart grid there, but why is it that we haven't seen any such cooperative suppliers and generation aggregators developed to date? What has been the obstacle in terms of replicating what works in the likes of Belgium here? And you've been involved in this, so what has blocked its real-world application compared to Belgium and Ireland?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think we can be a bit supportive here of this discussion because we have real evidence to bring. Evidence acquired by, state funding. Enterprise Ireland and the Industrial Development Authority have always been aware of the importance of power quality and power reliability in Ireland. And, we have always operated on the basis that we must find solutions that allow us to exploit, local willingness and ability to solve the problems here without compromising the grid. So, going back to one question there earlier that Eamon Ryan brought up there with regard to South Dublin County. The Enterprise Ireland and IDA funded the smart grid testbed in South Dublin, right? And South Dublin County Council were the main underpinner of that. And one of the biggest outcome of that has been the development of district heating, exploiting data centres, waste, and using that for heating places. Now, in that context, South Dublin County Council and the testbed was aware that utilities were looking at the issue of supplying power into that area, and it's very natural to try and supply power as locally as possible in order to take the pressure off the grid. Whereas the state saw great value in this, and Europe put 30 million into probably the fastest growing district heating scheme in Ireland, arising out of waste heat from data centres. And lots of community involvement was there within the whole South County. It took over 2 years for South Dublin County Council to get its voice listened to with regard to a simple maximum export capacity connection, 0. Because basically there was no interest in getting involved in solving the problem. So when the issue of generation came up on a local basis, there was no attempt to link that generation to district heating schemes. Obviously generation involves waste heat. in a very big way, and the best way of using waste heat is in an urban area. So the best way of dealing with that is to deal with communities, and that's microgeneration, and that's the very point that we're making. Microgeneration is not tiny little rooftop solar. Microgeneration is about people being able to solve their own problems in their own way. This is the community model, the European community model. It's not, you know, just simply an idea that Mega is putting across here at this. We have evidence that it took a long, long time to get connections in the testbed. We have evidence that none of the utilities got involved with the testbed. They ignored it completely, even though it was funded by the state, and that's an ongoing thing. That testbed went on to win for Ireland the first EU Lighthouse Smart City for Limerick, using the technology developed without utility support in Tala, but with support of TU Dublin and other universities in Ireland and other communities. So what I'm saying here is, the evidence is clear that there is not a willingness in Ireland to embrace the fact that we have to involve other people in the solution of the energy problem. And it's such an obvious thing. It is just simply common sense. So we've spent a long time treading this path to actually try and make this message clear to everyone, that this should not be dividing us, it should be uniting us. You know, we've gone past the days of empire building and utilities. We're going into a decentralized age of where digital information systems are very empowering for individuals and prosumers, and people can become more active. And this is very important for us if we want a society that feels, you know, happy with its governance, and not a society that's falling apart like in France. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Deputy Stanley, maybe finally on this.
Just to come back in, I know I had some brief questions earlier on, but just I suppose, you know, there is obviously different views, and there would be a feeling up to now, I suppose, that the big players weren't taking on board, you know, the need for microgeneration and that. But, you know, I welcome what Peter said today in his address and in answer to questions. I detect that there is a shift, and it's understandable that DSP was there, you know, one player, you know, for generations. But I still think, you know, it will be made up of an awful lot of small parts. But I do think that there will be, you know, there obviously is a need for the air grid. There is a need for DSP, you know, and will be, while there also will be those localised solutions. They look at just the, you know, and just acknowledge as well that, you know, and some of it, sometimes maybe the big players are criticised, but to acknowledge DSP's role with the pilot project, Peter, you know, that, you know, you went out and you done it, and I think that that's useful. It's useful for us as a learning exercise, and for yourselves and people who are interested in this, but also just acknowledge the EV charging points. You know, you rolled out that, huge success. You know what we're saying about it. It's not all in your hands, but DSP done that, delivered it free to the customers. We know that there has to be, that can't continue forever. We understand that as well, but it was making that start. So it's not all a negative picture, and there will be. I mean, it's look. This is a huge challenge that, you know, in rural Ireland, and we have a huge number of rural households. You know, it's a criticism, I suppose, a lot of people would have of planning system, in that a lot of one-off houses. So there's going to be an awful lot of EVs that are going to need to be charged. They won't be filled with petrol, they won't be filled with diesel in a few years. They'll be charged up with electricity at night. There's going to be a need for microgen to do that. How we get around those questions that Dudley is raising in relation to, you know, that localised solution, how that integrates with the grid, how you manage all of that. It's beyond my mind in terms of, because I'm not, even though I worked for DSP for a few years, I wasn't up the ladder, up that far out to understand exactly how everything worked. But it obviously requires a lot of technical expertise, and it's something that we shouldn't grind ourselves into the ground over. But we need to provide the policy and the legislative framework to allow for the localised solutions, how they're integrated with the national grid, how the ESB, you know, transition into where they have to go into the future. And I just think that, look, just acknowledge that I think that the contributions, I think, have been very useful, and certainly I have learned from the contributions from the four panellists here today, and thanks.
Thank you very very much, and can I take the opportunity of thanking all the witnesses here this afternoon coming before us. It's been a very worthwhile engagement, and we look forward to working with you into the future. So on behalf of the committee, to thank the witnesses, and this joint committee stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on the 14th of May.